would like to call to order the City of Oak Harbor Planning Commission regular meeting, March 26, 2019. Roll call today. Let the record show that Debbie Schwab is absent. Second item on the agenda today is the approval of the February 26th regular business meeting minutes.
I'll make a motion to approve the February 26, 2019 regular business meeting minutes.
I'll second the motion.
Okay, I have a motion second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
I'll abstain. I was not present. Third item is public comment. We set aside 15 minutes for any items that are not presently on the agenda for anyone in the audience. Seeing no one in the audience this evening, we'll head on to item number 4, the public meeting. This will be brought to us this evening by Development Services Director Steve Powers. Critical Areas Code Amendment, a public meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Planning Commission. As the Chairman indicated, this is some proposed amendments to our Critical Areas Code, particularly dealing with the wetland buffers. Some of this will seem strangely familiar to you because it was a topic that you spent a fair amount of time helping us with back in the 2016-2017 timeframe. And as you saw from your packet, we have some history to bring you up to speed on since you folks last had a touch on this. We want to explain to you why we're talking about some amendments tonight and then what those amendments potentially could be. No action is going to be required this evening. This is just a briefing. Next month we'll be back to you for the public hearing and see how things go at that time. So without further ado, I think I'll just turn right to the PowerPoint presentation. Also, as I mentioned in the pre-meeting, Senior Planner Dennis Lefevre is your normal voice on these issues, but he's not able to be here this evening, so I'm filling in for him. The presentation is courtesy of Dennis, so hopefully I do it justice. What I want to try to cover for you this evening then is what your previous review work was, what's taken place since you made your recommendation to the council, what the proposed amendments actually are, and what the next steps are from here. So you looked at these pieces of code with us in mid-2016, so almost 3 years ago, and then worked with us pretty heavily in 2017 across those months up there. You might recall that 2016 was a major comprehensive plan update year, and we also had to look at our development regulations. State recognized that that was going to be a pretty heavy burden for the local jurisdictions, and so they granted an automatic one-year extension on the timeline for the development regulations, in particular the Critical Areas Code, because that's just a ton of work no matter when you start that project. And so it would have been due in June of 16, but they granted an automatic extension, which is why we didn't really start talking with you about it until April of 2016. But then 2017, we spent a lot of time talking about Critical Areas Code, of which, as you know, wetlands are one of the critical areas. And then in June of 2017, you conducted your public hearing and you made a recommendation to approve the draft code to the City Council. So we took that item to the Council on July 5th and 26th. We were frankly trying to get it done inside of the one-year timeline that we had, the extension that we had from the state. Council had some questions, and as is their prerogative, they asked us to slow down just a bit. And so we came back to them in September of that year and tried to address their concerns. And their concerns primarily with the topic that we're talking about this evening were over the buffer widths that were being proposed as part of the draft code based upon ecology's very strong guidance to the local jurisdictions. And arguably, or admittedly, part of the challenge was that for the highest quality wetland, those buffers got pretty big. In reality, in Oak Harbor, we don't have those quality of wetlands, and so that, I think, caused some anxiety for reasons that we didn't really need to do, but nevertheless, they were in that draft recommendation. So Council said, let's pause here a bit. Let's see if we can come up with some different buffer widths ourselves. And so at their direction, we brought a consultant on board, Environmental Science Associates, or ESA, to help us look at selected wetlands throughout the community, and their memo from that time frame is in your packet, and that's where you saw those maps with the different wetlands. And we sought their guidance as to whether we could really do anything significantly different than what we had already proposed. So by the time we got all of that done and were able to return to the council, it was June of 2018. And so at that time, we discussed with them that ESA memo. As I said, we looked at 11 wetlands that were characterized based upon the Department of Ecology's 2014 rating system. We did not have or do not have any Category 1 wetlands and only 2 Category 2 wetlands. And so, again, that Category 1 was the one that I think that set the alarm bells off with the council, because there were 300-foot buffers, if I recall correctly, around that Category 1. And that's obviously a big swath of land, and that was their concern. And ESA also identified some buffer flexibilities that we frankly had already incorporated into our code and had been part of our code for some time. But nevertheless, they were tools that we had that let us address site-specific wetlands in the context of a site-specific development. What were the tools available to us to shrink the size of that buffer, to do buffer averaging, all of those tools that can take that basic shape and push it around a little bit on that piece of property. Key thing in here, as Dennis has highlighted for you, is the buffer widths recommended by ecology to protect wetlands in the state are often considered the best available science and are difficult to deviate from. As you are probably well aware, best available science is a term that we find in the state law. That's what we have to base all of our critical areas codes on, is this concept of best available science. What's the best level of information and knowledge out there that tells us how we protect this particular critical area, or we protect the public from that particular critical area if that's the case. So what else was going on at that time? Actually, two things which were really interesting in terms of their timing. In July of 2018, Ecology came out and allowed an administrative reduction of up to 25% of buffer widths if specific minimizing methods were incorporated into the development. So that was some flexibility that they brought forth after everybody had mostly completed their work. So the timing was kind of interesting. But they also, which was maybe even more interesting, adjusted their wetland rankings, which were identified with the moderate habitat function. And I don't want to get into that too much, but basically what they found was that they were requiring too large of buffer widths based upon their previous analysis. And when they re-looked at that information, they realized that it could be smaller. So we got some new administrative guidance for them about that time frame after we had the report from ESA, after you folks had done your work, but before council had adopted the code. So that takes us to August of 2018. We thought we were on the path to getting the code adopted at that time. And at the hearing, though, we did have some testimony from a wetland professional or environmental consultant who suggested that he saw some other areas within our code in which greater flexibility could be built into the code. So there was a lot of conversation at the council that evening as to what to do. Ultimately, they decided to adopt the ordinance that night so that we could become GMA compliant, because when you don't have your development regulations consistent with your comprehensive plan and consistent with GMA, you're not GMA compliant. And that has some actual consequences for the city. The most notable one is that we are ineligible for certain funding sources from the state if you're not GMA compliant. So as staff, we strongly encourage council to adopt the code that evening, because we were about a year past the 1-year extension, and we were nervous about that, to be honest. Council heard that, and to their credit, they approved the ordinance that night, but they did direct us to follow up with Mr. Shields to see what we could learn about the comments that he made. He did not provide anything in writing that evening. They were just verbal comments. So we did hear back from Mr. Shields, and that letter is included in your packet. We got that in November. We started looking at the materials that, and the letter, and sort of examining that in the months between November and February. We went to the council in February at their workshop and said, okay, we've looked at this, broke it down to, I think, 8 different categories or 8 different recommendations. By and large, we think that those could be incorporated into the code. There were a couple where we didn't think that that made a ton of sense, and one where we just couldn't see the practical application of it, so we told the council that as well, and I'll talk a little bit about that as I get farther into the presentation. And so we got general direction from the council that says, let's proceed forward with those things that have been suggested to us, and that's what brings me here to you this evening. So that's kind of hard to read. This will be easier for you. Okay, so what we did was we took Mr. Shields' letter. Ray, would you mind getting that and giving it to Blaine, please? Sure. Would you mind getting that one and handing it over to Blaine? So what we did is we took Mr. Shields' letter and the various suggestions that he's made and really broke those down into categories for your consideration. We shared something similar to this with the council, but we've revised it since then, which is why it wasn't in your packet. And I think what I want to just try to go through here quickly is that Dennis has categorized these, as you can see, either compensatory mitigation, buffer flexibility, regulated activities, and allowed uses. So although there are, I think, 9 or 10 different comments in there, they really fall into those 3 or 4 categories. The next column over tells you what does our current code say, the code that we have on the books today. The next column over gives you the recommendation from Mr. Shields, and then the far right-hand column tells you how we think we should respond to that particular recommendation. So let's take the very first comment there, compensatory mitigation. Current code allows preservation as a mitigation strategy if the city determines it to be in the best mitigation option. Mr. Shields' recommendation is that we add that to that particular subsection of the code, 20.24050, as an option for a combination of mitigation strategies. And staff thinks that that's something that we can support and recommend to you and to the council. So that's kind of how this table works. Let's drop down to comment number 3, then, if we could, on that table. It's in the category of regulated activities. The current code says that removal of soil in a wetland or buffer that's regulated requires review and permit. The suggestion was that perhaps we could create a threshold below which that removal of soil or that grading would not require a permit. And so we looked at that, we studied that, we tried to figure out what would be the practical application, how would we actually make that work. So we looked at our codes that deal with grading. Well, there's no minimum amount of grading which triggers the need for a grading permit. In theory, all grading requires a grading permit. So we can't say 5 cubic yards or less by the IBC or the IRC doesn't require a grading permit, and that's how we would tie it to this. So we couldn't figure out what a rational threshold was. Perhaps more importantly, we could not envision a scenario where somebody is grading or wants to move soil around inside of a wetland or a wetland buffer, and that's not associated with a larger underlying permit already. In other words, why would they just be moving dirt in a wetland or a wetland buffer, and that's all they're doing? It's always going to be tied to something else happening on that property. Or frankly, they're not going to be talking to us in the first place. They're just going to be undertaking that activity on their property. So we really couldn't see the practical application here, and we didn't want to set an arbitrary threshold for grading. And so from our perspective, That's not one that we would recommend adding into the code because we just don't see how it practically will work out. And you can sort of get the pattern here. So the next one down, comment number 4, compensatory mitigation. We had removed the preservation mitigation ratios because they really aren't applied that often, read ever. The suggestion is that perhaps we should have those still in there. And so, yes, we can add preservation back in there in terms of a mitigation technique of leaving that wetland in place. Buffer flexibility, 5A, this concept, and I think you probably saw it in Mr. Shields' letter and materials, this concept of paper fill as a strategy, which is really a way to reduce the buffer in a particular set of circumstances. And originally we thought, okay, well we can figure out how to make that work, and that would be good. But then as we looked at it, it's really not something that's widely used, and we think we can achieve the same goal by one of his other suggestions, which is this concept of innovative design concept. I don't know if I'm phrasing that correctly. That's a way in which we could accomplish the same thing. So what do we mean when we say innovative design? The parallel that I can give you is in the building code. So our building code says in a noise zone, you have to build your walls in a certain way to reduce the sound level inside of that building. So when you're in the noisier portions of our community, you're required by the building code to build your walls, have certain kinds of windows, certain kinds of doors. It's prescriptive. But there's an option in there. If you as the builder say, I can achieve that same level of noise reduction through a different wall construction, you can propose that to us, and we will look at it, and if it meets all of the things we have to meet, we can approve that. That's the same concept which is being suggested here in this innovative design category. So if somebody wants to propose a different way to protect the functions and values of a wetland than what's prescribed by our code, this new language would allow them to do that. And if through their wetland biologists they can demonstrate they're meeting the same things that our code would require them to do, but they're doing it in a different way, this new concept would give us the ability to approve that. And that seems like some pretty reasonable flexibility because there may be a better way to accomplish it than the way that's put in the code in 2019. Maybe somebody 2 years from now has a better way of doing it. So we can get behind that particular idea. I think you probably get the sense of this, and so I'll move on in the presentation. I can come back to try to help with questions if you have any. So what are the proposed amendments? I've covered some of these already. Allow preservation as a mitigation strategy. We're going to pass on putting in paper fill as an exact language in the code, and we're going to focus again on that innovative design approach. The soil removal threshold, I told you I don't think that we can find a practical way that we should be doing that. We're comfortable suggesting that we can put the preservation mitigation ratios back in the code. Innovative development design, I'm sorry, I've been misstating that. Innovative development design, that covers a couple of these pieces. Buffer flexibility if regional benefits, that's providing the opportunity to look at a larger regional system and adjust the buffer widths based on this broader good that we might be able to accomplish rather than looking at them just on a site-specific basis. So read that as desirable flexibility in dealing with a specific development application. Target mitigation disincentive, we think we should add that. And the drilling portals and buffers probably would be a rarely used situation, and so we think we could add that into the code as well. Where would these take place? Two main areas, I think. Chapter 20.12, which is the general critical areas regulations, and then Chapter 20.24, which are the wetlands. To refresh your memory, 20.12 gives us, as the name implies, the general regulations, the framework by which we're going to look at these specific types of critical areas, and 20.24 is the chapter devoted specifically to wetlands. So these proposed revisions would have to take place in both of those chapters. What are the next steps? As I've said, no action tonight. I'll be happy to help you with your questions to the best of my ability this evening. What we're really slating is targeting a public hearing in April. And if you're comfortable in making a recommendation at that time, we'll move it on to the council. If not, we'll continue to work with you and try to answer your questions. Regardless, we'll talk to the council at their workshop in April just to keep them apprised of where we are in this conversation with you. But if you are in a position of making a recommendation in April, we're going to try to get to the council at their second meeting in May. But again, as we always say, if you need more time than what our tentative schedule lines out, then we certainly need to give you that time.
Do we anticipate objections as happened at the last minute last year?
I don't. Well, tough question. Actually, it's an excellent question. We of course didn't anticipate them last time, but seeing as much as those late comments or last minute comments came from this particular gentleman, and we're addressing those, with this effort, I would not expect it. But we'll certainly reach out to Mr. Shields in advance so that he knows what it is that staff is working on.
You kind of caught us flat-footed.
It did, yeah. Yes. What other things could I help you with this evening?
Just for clarification, the paper fill option that he presented, which sounded pretty interesting, is that one of the innovative development design options that might be considered if somebody brought that forward?
That's how we see that.
Yeah,
what we see is that the innovative development design concept is a pretty good size umbrella.
Right.
And so this paper fill idea falls under there and maybe a couple other ideas. So rather than plug in these really specific ones, let's put the umbrella in there and create the most amount of flexibility that we can in this code.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. The other one, and we may have talked about this before when we covered this, but for some reason I was thinking about this earlier and it just kind of popped in my mind, back a few years ago when we had that thing where one of our elected officials sued the county for a wetland violation, and their qualified wetland professional turned out to be not as qualified as they thought it was, maybe?
Yes.
So does the state now define what a qualified wetland professional is, or does the county now define that?
Our code does. Our code talks about what a qualified expert is.
Okay.
And I'm pretty sure the state law did at that time as well, and I don't know where that particular individual struggled.
Gotcha.
Out there.
Thank you. That's all I had.
Yeah.
Here. Any other questions, guys?
Maybe I just didn't see it. I like the innovative development design premise. But since it's saying that you can come up with some alternative method as long as it protects as well as our prescribed methods do, where are the, what's the baseline for what the prescribed methods do that the innovative method would have to meet? Is that in here and I just didn't notice it, or does it have to be filled in some way?
So I think the way to answer that question,
That would be part of the innovative plan that would be acceptable. In other words, we might not say it per se, but if you can show that this method will work, it's part of this. Okay,
Right,
well,
but
we'll accept it.
we're saying we'll accept your alternate plan if it's as good as the standard plan. Where does it say how good the standard plan is? So how do you measure whether the innovative plan is as good as the standard without
Is
specifying
that in
what
the
the standard
permitting
is?
process?
yeah, I understand your question, and I'm going to try to find the place that I think that answer is at. I can answer it in a general sense, and I'll work to get you a better answer for next month's gathering.
Fair enough.
So our our baseline information is going to be those materials that Ecology produces and makes available to us. So they set forth the standards in terms of how the wetland professionals look at and rate a wetland. Is that a category 1? Is it a category 3? That kind of thing. They also set the standard in terms of what's the underlying science that's being used to identify how we're protecting those functions and values. In other words, how does that wetland work for its stormwater cleansing capacity, its wildlife supporting capacity, its plant life supporting capacity. All of this code is really based on those basic principles that they tell us how we're supposed to rate them, and they tell us what we're supposed to be trying to achieve in terms of that protection. So if you are a qualified wetland biologist, you know that that's the standard. Now, what's easiest is for there to be a relatively uniform set of buffers. If it's this kind of wetland, you throw a 150-foot buffer around it, you're done. Yeah. You're protecting it, right? But you as the qualified wetland biologist may say, I can achieve that same thing for that kind of wetland in 100 feet if I propose to do this, this, and this. And because you as an identified expert meeting the standards of the code, have that knowledge, that's the proposal that you're making. In terms of our ability to review it, if it's outside of our comfort level in terms of understanding that technical information, then our code allows us to hire a third party, unfortunately at the applicant's expense, to review that. Sure. And to say, okay, yes, that's actually meeting all of those standards, or no, it's not. But that's really the bedrock, if you will, I think, is Ecology's way to rate them, tells us what we're dealing with, and the science which supports the buffers that they have told the state to use. But I will work on a more specific answer for you, but in general, that's how that works.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Steve, along that same line, if a developer comes in with a proposal, is it not true that usually they come in with already an expert opinion based on this new proposal?
As a general rule, yes. If they are an experienced developer, yes. Then yes, they normally want to get out ahead of the game. And so they've done a lot of legwork, yeah. Literal and figuratively, on their property before they ever come talk to us. And so they probably have already engaged a wetland biologist to go out there and figure out what it is they're really dealing with. Because if you think about it from their perspective, what they really want to know is how much land area am I going to have left to do the thing I want to do? And what do I have to do to have that area, right? And so it behooves them to have a pretty good idea of that before they come talk to us. It doesn't always happen that way, and once in a great while, they're surprised by the fact that they have something on their property that they weren't quite aware of. And then they just have to regroup, and then they bring the right professionals to bear.
Because I know what we've seen is that, you know, they don't want to delay another meeting because meeting costs them. They're paying for all those specialists that are in the room. Sure. During that public hearing to start off with, and they don't want to pay them to come back again.
That makes sense.
They've kind of, based on what I've seen, is that they're anticipating that question, especially if they bring something new. They better bring the backup, you know, to support what they want to do.
Okay, that makes sense.
Any other questions that I could try to help you with this evening? So really, to summarize, these are basically, this is fine-tuning the code, right? So we have a very serviceable code right now. But the suggestions that were made by Mr. Shields, as we've talked about this evening, or as I've talked about this evening, I think we're comfortable in recommending the vast majority of them as fine-tuning to the code to improve it, to give as much flexibility and latitude as we can, but still meet our obligations. A couple of them we don't think we see the practicality, or we want to try to accomplish it in a different fashion. But at the end of the day, this is not a wholesale change to the existing code. It's a fine-tuning it so that it'll work a little bit better in certain development situations. So thank you for your
Okay.
time.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Steve.
Well, at this point, I will remind the folks here and in the audience that the next Planning Commission meeting will be April 23rd. There being no further business, I suspect that this meeting is adjourned.